Good morning, everybody. We're live from the birdhouse. It is July 12th. We're already halfway through July, and right now is when people are starting to see more reptiles and amphibians out there, both in their yards and while hiking. So today we're talking about some of the different types that you can find here in New York, especially in upstate New York. As always, if you have any questions or comments, you can put those in the little chat box. If you have any sightings, we love to know what kind of birds you're seeing. And of course, if you've got any butterfly sightings, if you've seen any monarch butterflies, there have been people seeing monarch butterflies, which is really exciting, getting them coming to their yards, and that the milkweed is in bloom. So they've been visiting that and laying their eggs on the milkweed. So that's a really exciting time. And also people are getting the young orioles coming back to their feeders now too. So the adults are bringing those young back to feeders, and that's really exciting as well. So I'm curious if any of you guys have seen that type of behavior also. So let's get started. And if you have anything to share, absolutely put those in the comments. So there was something that I saw this weekend that made me think that this would be an interesting topic. I was walking through the woods and I came upon a garter snake with a toad sticking out of its mouth, which was quite shocking. So toads, and we'll see some pictures of American toads, which we have, they do actually excrete a type of venom that comes out of the top of their heads. If you ever look at a toad, they've got these two little glands on the kind of the back of their head, and it does excrete a type of toxin, but the snakes are not affected by that, but you can almost see it kind of coming out of the toad there. It is a very brutal way to go, but there was a snake going right after a toad, and the toad was kind of puffed up to try to keep the snake from going after it. But that was my inspiration for this class here about amphibians and reptiles that we have here in New York. And it looks like Janine is on here from Michigan. A lot of these will apply to you as well. So in general, amphibians, just talking the wide range of things, amphibians are generally tied to water, especially to reproduce. So a lot of them will mate in the water or lay their eggs in the water. Some of them will have their larvae will be aquatic. So a lot of them are tied to water or very wet places. Amphibians have very slimy skin that they can breathe through, and they don't have any claws. So that's one way you can tell the difference between, say, a salamander and a skink is there are no scales on the amphibians, and they don't have claws if you're able to get close enough to them to take a peek. So reptiles, on the other hand, are generally adapted for land. Now, some of them are very aquatic, like there's some turtles that are very, very aquatic, but they're adapted well for land. They don't need to be in the water at all times. They have dry, scaly skin. They have shelled eggs, and their limbs do have claws. So those reptiles that do have limbs will have little claws on the edge of them. So let's get started with the different types of amphibians that you can find here in New York and through most of the East Coast. So for frogs, I thought I would put on their calls because the frogs do have such interesting chorus calls. And the first is the American toad. And this is probably a call you are familiar with hearing. So let's play this. So that's the American toad. And so that is their call. It's kind of like a long, drawn out trill. They will gather together usually in ponds or in really slow moving streams and lay their eggs. And they lay their eggs in long strands. So they're strands that have a whole bunch of eggs all together in them. You can kind of see it in this picture here of the toad, that behind its eyes, it kind of bulges out there. Those are those glands that have the toxin in them. They're in a family of of toads called Bufonidae, and they call them bufotoxins. So they all do have some kind of a little toxin in there. Not something that's going to kill you by any means, but so say if if your dog grabs onto a toad or tries to eat one, they could get quite sick. So it's usually not something that's going to be fatal, but it can cause people and animals to become quite sick. Here is the gray tree frog. If you come across a tree frog, it's probably going to be a gray tree frog, especially if you're seeing it. We have another tree frog I'll show you in just a moment, but the gray tree frog is the most common. That'll to porch lights and that kind of thing in the evening. If you have birdhouses out, you might even see a gray tree frog roosting in birdhouses. They're known to do that. They'll stick their heads out during the day to get some light and some heat. So they are known to do that. So they do kind of roost, almost like a bird will, in cavities. So they'll nest in hollow trees as well. So this is the gray tree frog. And the gray tree frog also has a green color morph, and that's here in the middle here where there's a picture of the 3 frogs. So if you do see a green frog, a green tree frog, I should say, here in New York, it's actually going to be a green color morph of the gray tree frog. Now there is a green tree frog that's further south, more in the Carolinas or so. So if you're down there, you might actually get the green tree frog, but this is the gray tree frog, and this is what it sounds like. You can hear this now. Even during the day, you can hear this sometimes, a little trill of the gray tree frog. And the other type of tree frog we have here is the spring peeper, which you've probably heard. In the early spring, they will have this really high-pitched call. They all congregate, usually again around ponds and marshes, to mate. The spring peepers are very, very small. They're only about an inch long or so. And so they're really, really tiny. And then you can also identify them because on their back, they have almost like this little X here, like a little cross, an X on their back. So this is the spring peeper, and this is what they sound like. So if you've ever been to any kind of wetland in the early spring, you've probably heard this. And if you've been close to the spring peepers, it's really, really loud. For such a small frog, they make a really, really loud sound. And they can be hard to see because they are just so small. But they are around. They're around all summer. But you're going to probably have the best chance of seeing them in the early spring when they're mating, and you can try to follow their call to see them up close. So that's a spring peeper. We also have what are called western chorus frogs, and this is what they sound like. And then there's the bullfrog. You can hear these guys, especially during the day as well as the night. These are really, really large frogs. They can be hard to tell the difference between, as far as looks go, between a bullfrog and a green frog. They can look quite similar. Their sizes can overlap. Their colors can be really similar. The bullfrog, though, have a really large, what's called a tympanum, and that's this resonating structure here that is behind their eye. And the bullfrog's tympanum is going to be larger than its eye. So we'll see the green frog coming up. The tympanum is going to be much smaller. But this is what your bullfrog will sound like. And bullfrog tadpoles can get quite large, and sometimes they can live in the water for more than a year. So they can get quite big. They eat small fish. They'll eat the larvae from other insects. So they can be quite voracious in a pond. So that is the American bullfrog. And then here's your green frog. So sometimes their sizes do overlap, but you can see the size of the tympanum there. It's smaller than the eye of the frog, whereas the bullfrog had a much larger one. And they're kind of greenish and brownish in color, and this is what they sound like. People say it's like the sound of the plucking of a guitar string type of sound for the green frog. Again, you can hear them during the day. Right now in the summer, they'll call all summer long, day or night. And then there's a wood frog. If you find yourself in the woods, especially if you're in a damp woods, you might see this little guy. They will hibernate in the leaves under the leaf cover, kind of dig a little hole in the ground, stay there all winter, and then emerge in the spring. They have this almost a black mask over their face, and this is what the wood frog sounds like. So then there is also the leopard frog, and leopard frogs you can of course find by water, but you can also find them in fields a lot too. If you come across a leopard frog, they are really, really good jumpers. Most frogs in general are really good jumpers, but the leopard frog really gives it kind of that extra oomph, and they really can launch themselves. So you might find these kind of in a higher up field that's a little bit further away from a pond. And the leopard frog is going to have way more spots on it than, say, your green frog would. The green frog is green and brown in color, but the leopard frog has all of these really beautiful spots on them. And this is what a leopard frog sounds like. You can hear the spring peepers in the background there, but it almost sounds like a snore. So interesting sound on the leopard frog there. So those are all the frogs I have to show you. It's not every single frog that you'll find in the state, but those are going to be the most common ones that you could find. And then there's salamanders. So you might have never seen a salamander, but they're definitely around. Again, as in places that are kind of wet, especially wooded places, and places that have streams are another place you can look for salamanders. The best thing to do is flip things over. That's the best way to find salamanders, flipping over logs, flipping over rocks that are in streams. Just remember to flip whatever you flip over to flip it back, because usually there's a whole bunch of things that have burrowed into the log or into the leaf litter. And that's where they live. So you want to make sure not to just leave it completely uncovered. If you're looking under things and pulling things up and looking under them, just want to make sure to replace that log, replace that rock. But that's the best way to find these salamanders is looking in streams or in ponds. You know, pull up a little rock, pull up a log that is in the forest, and you might see some of these guys. So here's some different salamanders that we do have locally. The first is called the Allegheny dusky salamander, and this is a type of salamander that's lungless. So amphibians can take in water and oxygen through their skin. They have super porous skin, and that's why they can be so susceptible to any kind of toxins in the water, any kind of pollution, because they absorb all of that into their skin. And the Allegheny dusky salamander is lungless. So it doesn't have any lungs at all. To breathe, it gets the oxygen through its skin, which is pretty amazing. They're about 3 to 5 inches long. They have a line that goes from their eye to their jaw to identify them. You can see this kind of light colored line there that goes from their eye to their jaw. You can find these in wet forest floors and near streams and creeks. This is one that you might find under a log and under rocks, and the larvae will develop in slow moving streams. So a lot of salamanders, their larvae have, they'll sometimes have exterior gills. So if you've ever been scooping things up from a stream or from a pond and you find something that kind of looks like a salamander, but it has external gills, that's the larvae will sometimes have that, and then they'll internalize as they get older. The blue spotted salamander, this is a really, really cool looking one, about 3 to 5 inches long. This is one that's called a mole salamander. There's a group of different salamanders considered mole salamanders. They'll burrow into the ground and into the mud. They have a very, very long tail, which they can detach if threatened. So some of these salamanders, as well as the reptiles, if something grabs it, if the predator grabs that by the tail, they can actually detach that tail, and the tail usually wriggles around for a while to keep that predator busy while the creature goes elsewhere. These blue spotted salamanders you can find in damp forest floors, wooded swamps. Again, under logs is the best place to go to look for them. The mud puppy, we do have common mud puppy around here. Now they actually maintain their characteristic of salamander larvae with those external gills. So this is a really good example of what the external gills look like here. They are pretty large. They can be 10 to 11 inches long, so they can be quite large. And you can find them in rivers, streams, ponds, and lakes. They're very carnivorous, so they'll eat crayfish, insects, larvae, fish, snails. And here's those external gills here that the mud puppy will have for its whole life. And kind of similar to the mud puppy, except much, much larger, and it doesn't have those external gills, is the eastern hellbender. This is America's largest aquatic salamander. It can get up to 2 feet long, so this can be quite large. Now, they do require really clean water and running streams. So because of that, they are endangered in many places due to pollution and poor oxygen levels in the water. They're only found in 2 places in the state, both of which are further south of Rochester, but they're such an interesting creature. I thought I would add them here to this presentation. So this is the eastern hellbender. They're going to be more common a little bit west of us. There is what's called a four-toed salamander, and you can find them in forests and wetlands. They have a very ivory white body with polka dots. They're very small and slender, and they're about 2 to 4 inches long. So really easy to identify there with that bright white belly with the speckles. This is probably the most common salamander that you'll find here. It's the northern redback salamander, 3 to 5 inches long. You can easily find these under leaf litter or under logs. This is another lungless salamander, so it gets all of its oxygen through its skin. The young are completely terrestrial, so they don't have any kind of aquatic larva, and they have that nice red stripe that goes down their back. So northern redback salamander, probably the most common one that you'll find here in the area and throughout the East Coast. There is one that has the lovely name of the northern slimy salamander, black with white polka dots, another lungless salamander. They can be kind of large, 5 to 6.5 inches or so, found in damp wooded areas. And again, the juveniles are terrestrial. The red-spotted newt is pretty cool. Red-spotted newt is here in the corner, in the bottom right-hand corner. This is an aquatic salamander called a newt. And sometimes you can find the adults out of the water, but most of the time you're going to find them in the water. They do have these bright red spots on them. The teenagers, if you will, after they mature from their larval stage, sometimes they will have a phase called the red eft stage, and that's this salamander here up at the top, this bright orange salamander with the red spots on it. Not all red-spotted newts have this stage, which is pretty interesting about them. Some of them will just go from, so they'll hatch out of their egg, there'll be that larval stage where they're in the water as a larva, and then some of them will just transform into adult. Others will have this red F stage that can take about 3 years until they mature to an adult, but they don't all do it, which is pretty interesting. So you might find the red eft in more terrestrial locations. So if you're hiking through the woods, you might see these red efts. So really cool little thing that the red-spotted newts have is this red eft stage, very different from the other species that we're seeing here. I love this one. This is called the spotted salamander. This is a really large salamander, about 6 to 7 inches long. They mate in what are called vernal pools, and that's pretty common with other mole salamanders as well. Vernal pools are in the spring when the snow is melting and you're getting all that runoff. It can form these large pools that are only there temporarily, and those are called vernal pools, and that is where a lot of these salamanders will congregate and they'll mate and then they'll disperse elsewhere. So they're really, really important for the mating habits of the salamanders and frogs as well. They live in mature forests, but their numbers are in decline due to deforestation. Now, you might just happen to come across a lizard in New York, especially if you're doing some hiking further south. This is the northern coal skink, and it has dark stripes that are running down its body. So now this is a lizard. So we're seeing before salamanders. So the coal skink will have scales on it. So that's going to differentiate it from the salamanders. And then it also has those claws on its fingers, if you get on its fingers and toes, if you get close enough to see that. They're quite large. They're 7 inches long, including their tail. They hide under debris in forests in and around rocks, and they are carnivorous. They eat a lot of insects. They eat millipedes. So this is a lizard species here in New York called the northern coal skink. And then there's turtles. We can't talk about reptiles without some of our turtles. This is the bog turtle, probably not going to be one that you see or see very often at all. It's a very small turtle. It's endangered here in New York. It's only about 3.5 inches or so. It has a bright orange yellowish blob on the side of its head. They do require very specific habitats, and that is what makes them increasingly rare. They like wetland bogs with clean water, lots of plants, but little trees. Finding that type of habitat can be quite difficult. So that's why you probably won't come across a bog turtle as often as you would other turtles, but they are around here in New York. Then there's the map turtle. These are really, really cool looking. If you look closely at it, you can see why it gets that name. It has these beautiful patterns on it that resemble the lines of a map. They're about 4 to 10 inches long. They like wetland habitats. They spend the majority of the time underwater. So it's not going to be like some of the other turtles we'll see in this presentation that like to sit out on logs and sun themselves. They tend to spend their time in the water. They have jaws that are strong and adapted to crack open mollusks and crayfish exoskeletons. So they have a really strong jaw, and that is their main source of food. There's snapping turtles as well. If you've spent any time outside this late spring and early summer, you might have seen snapping turtles emerging from their ponds. So snapping turtles will spend their time in shallow ponds, slow-moving streams. They are going to be in the water most of the time, unless, of course, they're sunning themselves out on a log, but they will leave their ponds in order to lay eggs or to reach a new habitat. If their habitat's drying out, they might move to a new habitat. But most of the time, if you do see them out of the pond, and I know sometimes you see them trying to cross the road, what they're doing, those are the females, and they're going to lay their eggs. So they're a really large turtle. They have a very large head. They have a long spiked tail and a really long neck. Their average shell length is anywhere from 8 to 14 inches in diameter. And some of their neck is so long that they can actually stretch it about halfway around their shell. So you don't want to pick up a snapping turtle if there is one around, especially by the front of its shell, because their neck stretches out so long that they could grab your hand. So you want to be careful of that. They are most aggressive when on land, which makes sense. It's usually the females, and they're going to lay their eggs. They're on a mission, so they will do that. They'll lay their eggs sometimes even in gardens if people have sandy soil. They'll lay their eggs, and then they'll go back to their pond, and then a few months later, you might see little turtles emerging from your garden. So pretty cool stuff there about the snapping turtle. There is another really interesting turtle in the state called the Eastern Spiny Softshell. Really cool looking turtle. It is a very flat, it's a very kind of like a pancake type of shape, and it has a really round shell. There's no scales on the shell. So if you think of the other turtles we've seen, they do have actually large scales on their shell. Like its name suggests, the spiny softshell has no scales on it at all. What's different also about this turtle, it has a really long pointed nose or snout, which it uses as a snorkel. So it can be floating in the water, and it can let its head kind of float to the surface, and it'll use its nose like a snorkel. These can be quite large. They can go anywhere from 14 to 25 inches as adults. As they age, they'll just keep growing. That's typical with reptiles. They're very fast, agile swimmers, and they can be found in ponds, marshes, and in rivers. So this is the spiny softshell, really cool, different, interesting looking turtle. This is probably, besides the snapping turtle, which are really common, the painted turtle is probably the most common turtle you'll see here because they do like to sun themselves. They'll bask in groups on logs around the shore, around marshes, around ponds. Super common. They're bright. They have bright red and yellow markings. So they do have these bright yellow markings behind their head, these two bright yellow dots. And then their neck and their shell has a lot of yellow and red on them. So they're really, really pretty. They're omnivorous. They eat plants as well as insects, small fish, snails, and slugs. So really common little turtle that we do have here in the area. They grow to be about 7 to 9 inches long. There are red-eared sliders. So they look very similar to the painted turtle, but you'll notice that there's no yellow dots here behind their eye. They have this red marking, this red splotch here. They are not a native species, but they are introduced from the pet trade. People are known to get these as pets and then just release them into ponds when they don't want them anymore, which is not a great idea to do ever. So they have red marking on their face. They're about 5 to 8 inches, so they're about the same size as that painted turtle. And cold water is what limits their range. So sometimes it gets too cold here for them to survive. So that's another reason you don't want to just release them somewhere. In the south, they're more established as a species that can survive because their winters are warmer. So they do have populations spread throughout the state, but this is one you might see even sunning itself with some painted turtles on a log there. This is the red-eared slider. Spotted turtles are another species that we do have here. Again, not one that you're most likely to see. They are a species of special concern due to habitat loss and pollution. They do have a dark brown shell with a whole bunch of little polka dots on it. They're about 4.5 inches large, so they're kind of another small turtle. They like shallow water with abundant vegetation, and they're tolerant of cold temperatures but not hot. So they're going to be more of a northern species. So this is the spotted turtle, another species we have here. And then there's the snakes. The most common snake you'll find here in our area is the garter snake. Probably same with all of you guys watching here. If you're on the East Coast, at least, the garter snake is the most common. Their colors can vary quite a bit. They can sometimes have a lot of yellow, sometimes have red. The one I saw over the weekend eating that toad almost had like bluish spots on it too. So their colors can vary quite often. They can look quite different. They can grow anywhere from 3 to 5 feet long. They're not venomous, but bites can inflict pain and swelling, so you want to be careful if you're handling snakes at any time. They give birth to live young, which is really interesting. They're usually we think of you either lay eggs or you give birth to live young, but garter snakes are something called ovoviviparous, where their eggs are inside of their body, they hatch inside of their body, and then they will give birth to live young. A whole bunch of little tiny snakes that once they give birth, they're just out on their own. And many also secrete a foul smell when handled. If you've ever picked up a garter snake, you might get a whiff of something that smells bad. That's in order to keep predators away. So this is your garter snake, the most common snake you'll see here. This is if you've got snakes in your garden, it's probably going to be the garter snake. We do have black rat snakes, especially in the southern part of the state. They're the largest snake in North America. They can get up to 6 feet long. They can be quite large. They do prefer wooded areas, and they're very good climbers. So they are known to climb up trees. If you are somebody that attracts purple martins and you see that there are guards to keep snakes out, the black rat snake is going to be the snake you should be most worried about because they are such good climbers. They are known to climb up poles. They can go after birds, mammals, eggs. So they do climb up trees to get to bird nests, all that kind of stuff. They are a constrictor, so they do constrict their prey once they do get a grip on it. And they inflict a painful bite. So probably not the type of snake you want to just grab and make friends with. The black rat snake. We also have what's called an eastern hognose snake. Now this can also vary in coloration, but it mimics a venomous snake. So I'll show you kind of how to tell the difference between a venomous and a non-venomous snake. But they have that kind of triangular diamond-shaped head, which makes you think twice that it could be venomous, but they actually are not a venomous snake. They grow to 2 to 3 feet long. They eat primarily frogs and toads, and they do what's called death feigning. So if you come across a hognose snake, they might look like they're dead. They might be just kind of on the road, upside down, but they're doing a death feigning, and they'll do that in order for predators to just leave them alone and go elsewhere. So really neat behavior that they have. But this is the hognose snake. It does look a lot like a venomous snake, but it's not. And when in doubt, you always just want to leave them alone anyway. We do have what are called milk snakes. They have red blotches along their body. They also mimic venomous snakes as far as their coloration goes. They can be 2 to 3 feet in length. They are found in forests, fields, marshes. They're usually found under objects if you have a rock wall. Eastern milk snakes love to curl up in the rock wall. That's where I've always seen them, as in some kind of a rock type of structure. But they can mimic the coloration of venomous snakes. They can often have like this snake up top here, and that makes you think twice that it could be venomous. They're not venomous, but they still look that way. We have something called the red-bellied snake, and these are quite small. They're only 7 to 10 inches long. You can find them in forests, fields, and bogs, often by water. They're carnivorous, so they eat slugs, insects, larvae, worms, and like their name suggests, they do have that bright red belly. Sometimes you can find them under leaf debris in the woods, but that bright red belly is what will identify them as a red-bellied snake. So really small little guy that we have here, but they are around, so you might come across one. Another fairly common snake is the northern water snake, especially if you spend any time by a lake, by a pond, by marshes. You might come across this fella right here. They average around 3 feet, and they are found around water where it hunts. They're carnivorous. They eat a lot of fish, frogs, worms, salamanders. They'll even eat young turtles or small mammals. They're not venomous, but they're aggressive. So sometimes they'll coil up. They almost will kind of coil up like a venomous snake would. So they can look quite threatening. And apparently they have a very painful bite if you happen to get too close to one. But you can see these even sometimes swimming around in water. So if you see a snake swimming in a stream or in a marsh, other species will do that too, but it's probably going to be a water snake. So these are quite common around here as well. So how do you tell the difference between venomous and non-venomous snakes? Because we do have a couple of venomous species that aren't really common, but you can find them around in the state. So for example, that water snake or that hognose snake or milk snake that can sometimes look like a venomous snake, they will still have this round pupil of the eye. So it's round as opposed to looking almost like a cat eye or having an elliptical pupil. So venomous snakes will have that cat eye type of look. They also tend to have a pointed snout that kind of points up, whereas non-venomous snakes will have more of a rounded face, rounded snout. Now that hognose snake has kind of a pointed nose too, so that doesn't really apply, but that's another way. And then a lot of the vipers or the venomous snakes will have this heat sensing pit here, which almost looks like a second nose. They can sense heat from different animals. And then their head shape is usually very broad, and it's kind of in the shape of more of a triangle or a diamond, depending on how you look at it. So they have kind of this more bulky looking head, whereas your non-venomous snakes tend to have kind of more of a a thinner head. There's also differences on the underside of the snake, but you probably don't want to get close enough to really inspect those. So the head shape is the big thing. And then if you get close enough to see the eye, if they do have that elliptical pupil, that cat eye type of look, like the cottonmouth snake here, yes, they are most likely venomous and you want to stay away. And here you can see that heat sensing pit here on the face of the snake. So it's in between the eye and the nostril. So really, really important things to know. And again, not every snake follows this rule, but here in New York, these are really good rules to go by. So there are a couple of venomous snakes that are around in the New York area, especially southern New York. The first is the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. They have a large body, a large head. They are a type of pit viper, so they do have that heat sensing organ that's in between the eye and the nose. They're 1 to 3 feet in length. They prefer wet areas, and they're venomous, but also endangered in New York due to habitat loss. They're only found in 2 places in the state, Bergen Swamp and the Oneida Lake swampland. So they are around in the area, but the odds of you coming across one, unless you're seeking them out, are pretty low. Now, we also have timber rattlesnake, and timber rattlesnake can be found in Letchworth Park. So they're going to be more common than the eastern Massasauga rattlesnake, but they are still, their populations aren't that strong. They can be anywhere from 36 to 60 inches, so they can get quite large. For most of the Northeast, this is the only rattlesnake that's found. So there's not a lot of places in the Northeast that have more than one species. We're kind of special in that regard. They are abundant in some areas, but the timber rattlesnake population has severely declined in numbers and distribution in New York due to unregulated collection, hunting, habitat destruction. In 1971, there was a bounty outlawed there. So for a while, there's a bounty on these snakes where if you brought, if you killed some and brought some in, you'd get some money. So that was taken away in 1971. So that has helped with some population being rebounded. But in local areas where they are found, sometimes they are persecuted by landowners who don't want them on their property. And then in 1983 here in New York, the rattlesnakes were designated as a threatened species. So they are around, but the odds of you coming across one aren't very, very good. So that's everything I have prepared for you guys today. If you have any questions or comments, you can absolutely put those in the little comment box. We had Janine watching from Michigan. So a lot of these will also apply to you, Janine. Duster says, good morning. Whistles to Animals says, I just wanted to say thank you so much for all these presentations that you do. I love all the native wildlife that you talk about. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Tanya talking about salamanders, saying, wow, that's amazing. Duster says, love mud puppies. Yeah, the mud puppies are really cool. They're that salamander that have the external gills. And let's see if I can pull up the picture of the mud puppy here. Yeah, they are really cool looking. They almost look like a little alien. Ed says, we used to have leopard frogs at our place, but haven't seen them in years. Amazingly fast. They were all but impossible to catch. Love the peeper songs in the spring. We will see some blue-spotted salamanders here. Beautiful deep blue spots. Great show. Thanks. So here's the leopard frog. And yeah, they are amazingly fast. It's like you see one second and then they've hopped away really, really quickly. And see, Tanya says, never seen it. Duster says, I used to have newts by my front door up where the light is, and they just lived there and came out at night. Oh, neat. So we were talking about different salamanders and newts, and there's the red-spotted newt here that we do have in the area. Let's see. Tanya says, I just read the title, Reptiles of New York. That's why I haven't seen them. They must be watching from some other place. She says, I used to have a turtle. That's great. We've got some turtle emojis popping up here. Let's see. So Thanya says it was like a quarter big when I first had it and grew really big. It also ate the fish in the fish tank. Oh boy, it was probably, my guess would be, it sounds like you probably had a red-eared slider, but you never know. There's a bunch of different species that you can get as pets. Lynn says, good morning. We had a pretty big snapping turtle cross the street into our neighbor's yard, then came into our garage. All right. Well, that's an interesting sighting. She says animal control helped us rehome it into the woods next to our house. Hope she is okay. Oh, that's funny. That's not something you necessarily want to come home to, is a big snapping turtle in your garage. So it sounds like it was rehomed into the woods next to their house. Hope she's okay. I would assume she's okay, especially if they rehomed it somewhere right next to where it was going anyway. I bet it'll be just fine. So that's funny. Janine says, great show. Thanks. You're welcome. And Callum says, newts are so cute. Yes, they are. They're very, very cute. Cuter than the snapping turtle, I guess we could say here. That's on the screen right now. But it looks like that's everybody's comments and questions. We'll be back on Saturday with another broadcast, giving you an update about what kind of things people are seeing in their backyards and the different birds around and how you can attract them. If you have any questions, you can always contact us at the Birdhouse. And until then, we'll see you on Saturday and have a great week. Bye-bye.